Hello everyone, this is Deltrox, and today I'm going to be talking about combat metrics. So first thing you need to know about combat metrics is that it is an add-on for the Elder Scrolls Online that essentially tracks your incoming and outgoing damage, buffs, and debuffs. This is most often used by damage dealers or DPS players because it tracks how much DPS they're doing. It's often called parsing because in this add-on it'll show you a log that is a bunch of information or a parse of all the damage in a set amount of time. And so it is typically used in DPS parses on a 3 million or 6 million health dummy. As you can see next to me, this right here is a 6 million health target dummy, and this over here is a 3 million health target dummy. So typically the parses are done with full ultimate, with a potion partial of the way through. So you see here I took a potion and my cooldown starts to go down. DPS do this because it lets your potion come up sooner and when you actually need it in a fight. So you can see right about now is when I would start, and so then as my resources started to drop from using all my skills, you see, like, if I just sit here and spam Vigor, then you can see that, like, my resources would be about here. My potion comes up, and then it's actually restoring resources instead of my resources being here when I need it, and I'm not getting the full benefit of my potion. If you are a Magicka class, most Magicka classes will self-Ellie drain, which basically means that in place of a shield, they'll use this skill here, Elemental Drain. This applies Major Breach, which gives you about 10% damage, and is normally applied by your tank with this Pierce Armor skill. But it also gives you Minor Magicka Steal, which helps your sustain. And healers should always be using this ability in dungeons and trials, and so that's why Magicka users are allowed to get away with it, per se, in parses. So the whole reason that we parse is so that guilds, like trial guilds or dungeon guilds or whatever, can know what you're doing, not what your group is doing or how your team is benefiting you, but how you yourself are doing. And so, because tanks provide a whole bunch of important debuffs, Crusher, Major Fracture and Breach, Alkosh, Warhorn, things like that, and healers provide Minor Berserk and Major Courage and also provide Warhorn, and so that will usually raise your damage by 20 to 30% in like a pure static environment like target dummy parses are. And so in an actual fight, your damage should be at least equal to what your target dummy parse is. But fights are, of course, a little bit more hectic. There's a lot more going on, and so your damage tends to be a little bit lower. But this is where you see certain players getting like those ridiculous like 80,000 damage parses, is because they have all of these excuse me, they have all these other outside buffs helping their damage. And so this means that some classes are naturally going to have an advantage while parsing, most specifically Nightblades, because Nightblades, as one of their class passives, so like one of these abilities here, they get access to Minor Berserk, which is 8% damage just straight across the board. And this is a buff that is typically given to you from the ability Combat Prayer, which I don't even have the Resto staff unlocked. But it's a Restoration staff ability that gives you Minor Berserk, you and everyone you hit with it, Minor Berserk, which increases their damage done by 8%. And this does not stack with Nightblades. It's the Major Minor buff system. And so that will make Nightblades, just in general, their parses look bigger than other classes. This goes even further when you are a Stamina Nightblade, because Stamina also have the only are the only class that has access to Major Fracture. Stamina Dragon Knights technically have access to it in the other morph of this ability, Venomous Breath, but that ability typically isn't even being used anymore by most Stam DK rotations. And so Stamina Nightblades are going to look about 20% better than their counterparts. And so now another thing to keep in mind when looking at somebody's parse is what sets they're using. There are 3 different sets that are popular right now that really boost your damage in a single target situation, like when you are just going up against a target dummy, but that in general, I'm not going to say that they're bad, because they're certainly not. Each one of these sets is an amazing set, but they're going to look weaker in AoE pulls, which tend to be the majority of pulls in dungeons at the very least. In trials, they're a bit more focused on boss fights. And so these 3 sets are Spell Strategist, which increases your spell damage by 500 against that one specific target. Arms of Reliquin, which builds a stacking dot against a target that does a whole shit ton of damage, usually about 7 to 10,000 damage per second. And Zon, which is a monster set that is not only single target, but is also melee, and is for Magicka users. And so if you see something like a Magicka Nightblade using Zon in a parse, there are a ton of situations where Magblades can't get into melee range to use Zon, and so it can be a bit of a misleading parse, because Zon usually does about 3 to 4,000 damage, which is about a 2,000 damage advantage over things like Falcon Scoria. And so now I want to talk about the set Mantle of Sororia. This is the other Cloudrest set. This is the Magicka DPS set from Cloudrest that basically, instead of giving you a ramping dot like Reliquin does, it gives you a ramping spell damage buff. And the drawback to Sororia is that, like, let's say my Endless Hail right here is my Sororia circle. I believe it's quite a bit smaller than this as well. I would need to go in and out of this circle if I needed to run around and do other mechanics. And if ever I was outside of that little tiny circle for more than 5 seconds, then my buff would restart from 0. And so there are a lot of fights where it's very difficult to have your Sororia have any kind of reasonable uptime like you see in target dummy parses. And so that's why this set is typically not allowed in target dummy parses, because it's very difficult to replicate the effect that it provides in a target dummy parse in an actual combat scenario. In a bit more of an extreme example of Sororia, there are several sets that are considered target dummy hero sets, is what I call them. They're sets that look really good on a target dummy, but provide almost no benefit outside of a parsing situation. And these sets are mainly Spinners, which gives you a bunch of Magicka penetration, which Magicka DPSs don't need the Magicka pen. A Slimecraw, which gives you Minor Berserk, which, as we talked about earlier, should be provided by your healer, and so would be a redundant buff in a group situation. Night Mother's Gaze, which provides Major Fracture, which should be provided by your tank. And then, in some cases, Spriggans, Twin Fang Snake, and Krogs are also dummy hero sets, because each one of those sets provides quite a bit of physical penetration. And so if you have a really well-coordinated group with like Torugs and Alkosh and Crusher and Major Fracture and Minor Fracture and all of those things at really high uptimes, then these sets can mean that you're over-penetrating. But in general, Stamina DPS have a pretty hard time finding penetration compared to Magicka DPSs, and so in general these sets are pretty okay. And so then finally I want to talk about the opposite of target dummy hero sets, which are sets that really don't look very good on a dummy at all, but in an actual fight, they provide you with some pretty meaningful buffs. So the best example of this is Vicious Ophidian, um, or VO, as a lot of people call it. In a target dummy parse, this set gives you 8% stamina cost reduction, which isn't that great. But in a dungeon scenario or a scenario like Maelstrom Arena or Dragonstar Arena, it gives you lots of extra stamina and lots of major expedition, which helps a ton for stamina DPS in those scenarios because it gives you a lot of extra survivability and helps your resource management even more than just the 8% cost reduction, which is already a fairly strong 5-piece bonus. But because of this, pretty much nobody actually does dummy parses in this set, but it's still a set that sees play all the time. And so now let's go ahead and do a dummy parse here. For those of you who know me, you know that I am not a DPS. I am very obviously not in a very good DPS setup. I mean, I have 30k health right now. But I just want to show you in general what it looks like and how a parse generally starts. So I am not using real potions right now. I'm using trash stamina potions right now. And so I'm not going to worry about letting my potion cooldown run out. I'm going to just use it when I need it. Normally, in a parse, you would want to use your potion, like I said earlier, so that you get the major brutality and major savagery, or if you're a Magicka version, major prophecy and major sorcery from your potion. But I will be using my potion purely for resource management in this, and so I'm not going to worry too much about it. But in this parse, I'm going to go ahead and buff up first. So I have my igneous weapons, and my only other buff is going to be my Flames of Oblivion, which is where I'll start the parse. So I'll put on Flames of Oblivion, throw down that, heavy attack, and then begin my parse. So I am on a heavy attack stam DK right now. And so on my front bar, I will heavy attack in between every attack, but on my back bar, I just light attack so that I can get back onto my front bar again as quickly as possible. I'm getting pretty close to execute here, and so you notice that I start putting in my execute ability, Reverse Slice, into my rotation. Most execute abilities don't start until 25%, which is right here. And so this is where I'm going to stop a lot of my abilities and just Reverse Slice spam. I keep Caltrops, Endless Hail, and Poison Injection going, but otherwise I just focus on weaving my Reverse Slice. Alright, so there you go. Again, I am not in a very good DPS setup. I don't have a lot of my passives, like I don't even have Trap Beast morphed, or anything like that. So don't take this as an actual damage parse, because as you see, I got about 14k there, which is pretty bad. But let's look at the combat metrics here. So you can see this is the fight. It'll tell us what our main target was, which is the target skeleton, which makes sense. That was the only thing I was hitting. And so if you click on this, it'll make sure that this is the only thing that we're looking at for damage. Because I'll show you in like this example, there's a bunch of different things, and so my damage is all over the place. So even though I did 3,900 damage total, this is on a tank by the way, I only did 2,600 DPS to the boss. But we'll go over that in a second. So for a DPS parse, there are a few important things to keep note of. When I look at a DPS, the first thing I want to look at is how many light attacks did I do in the time. Okay, so if you're a much better DPS than I am, you'll be getting to about 90% of, let's see, I'm trying to think of the right way to word this. You'll be about 90% of the way to 1 light attack per second. So you'll be at about 0.9 light attacks per second, which is really, really good, like I said. If you're just starting out, or I have a friend, he plays on really high ping, and so he has a little bit more trouble light attack weaving than people like me with my ping of about 80 usually. I try to, if you're one of those players, I would try for 1 light attack every 2 seconds, which would be about half a light attack a second, right? So in this parse, that would be about 105 light attacks. So about double what I have. Keep in mind that I was doing a heavy attack rotation as well, so you can add the heavy attacks and the light attacks together, and I was a little bit better. I was almost there. I was at about 100 like weaves when my goal was 105, so I did pretty good. But like I said, if you're an absolute monster of a DPS player and you're really trying to get your numbers up, really look at light attack hits over active time. And then your other things you're going to want to look at is your buffs. So as you can see here, I was using the Briarheart set, and so Briarheart had a 92% uptime. That's pretty good. Depending on what set you're using, you want a different like proc rate on it, but on sets that you want to be up all the time, 90% is usually about where you want to see that, 90% or higher. On sets that aren't always active, sets like Burning Spellweave and Ravager, you're wanting for more of a 60% uptime on those ones. And so if you also look here, my Molten Armaments and Flames of Oblivion were my 2 main buffs. I only had them up about 75% of the time, and so I know that's right away something that could have increased my DPS if I would have had better uptimes there. Again, about 90% is like the low end of where you want to be sitting on abilities like that, and so really just watch your timers better and things like that. Brawler is a dot that was only up 46% of the time, which keep in mind, I didn't have it going during execute, and so execute is usually about 15% of the fight if you start executing at 25%, because execute just naturally goes faster. Of course, this matters if you're on like a Stam DK, which has almost no change in rotation if you're doing a dual wield and bow when you hit execute, or if you're on something like a Stamina Nightblade, which they basically just turn into impale machines, sub 25%. So yeah, but yeah, you can look through the debuffs and basically just see exactly where your uptime of your abilities were, including your dots and things like that. Then if you look at debuffs out, you can see that like my poison arrow was only on the target 70% of the time, so that's yet another thing that I didn't keep up a whole lot. Brawler bleed, because Brawler has a buff component and a debuff component, we can see that the buff component, which is the shield, was up 46% of the time, but the actual dot itself was up 57% of the time. Venomous Claw is another single target dot. Trap Beast, single target dot. You notice that AoE dots or ground AoEs, like Endless Hail, doesn't show on this because this is only showing single target. So like even if I deselect the target skeleton, it still won't show me how the uptime for my Endless Hail. And so that's something that you kind of have to guess more than anything. So you can see here, my Endless Hail had a total of 306 hits over 210 seconds. But if I look at the actual skill, go into Weapon, Bow, Endless Hail, it hits basically twice every second. And so in a 210 second parse, I would want about 400 hits of Endless Hail instead of 300. So about 75% uptime, which is right about where everything has been with me on this one. Some other important things to note is you can see how much of your damage was critical damage versus how much of it was normal damage. And so this is especially important if like you're considering what Mundus to use. If you have more critical damage, then you might want something like the Thief, or if it ever gets buffed a little bit, even the Shadow to boost your critical hit damage. And then the last thing that I want to point out is your average and your max hit for things. And so you can see that my Reverse Slice hits for its maximum hit was 19.8k, which is pretty hard hitting when you compare it to anything else. My next highest looks like it was my heavy attack at 12.8k. And that was my bow heavy attack, I believe, because you see that my light attack is split up. And so that'll be my dual wield, or not my dual wield, my two-hander light attack and my bow light attack. So that was probably my bow heavy attack that hit so hard there. But anyways, getting off track. This matters because certain classes, specifically the Magicka Templar and both Stamina and Magicka Nightblades, that have really hard-hitting abilities with Radiant Oppression, or the Jesus Beam, and then the Spectral Bow. And so that's why you typically see those three classes, more so than something like a Magsork, run the Thief Mundus. Because if you have something that's hitting that hard, you want that ability to crit. Because crit is, of course, a percentage multiplier, and so bigger numbers means that they're going to get even bigger. But something like a Magsork, where you have lots of medium-sized numbers just hitting a lot, the Thief isn't as important, and something like the Apprentice or the Lover will probably outperform it. So now, finally, I want to talk about reading combat metrics if you are not a DPS, like I am. And so you don't have to look at my horrendous 14.3k parse anymore. So if you are a tank specifically, combat metrics is really helpful because it'll show your uptime of your debuffs. If you are a healer, this gets to be a bit more tricky because you have to check your buffs on yourself, and you can't check it on other people. And most of the healer abilities also target yourself, but there are some that will only target allies, and so it gets to be a bit more tricky. But looking at it from a tank perspective, you can see that I have just absolutely horrendous uptimes on everything. This is the Overfiend. This is the first boss in ICP, the zombie boss where a whole bunch of shit spawns. And the reason that this looks absolutely awful, and why I only have like a 7% taunt, is because I only focused on the Overfiend himself. So if you click on the Overfiend, it'll then take you to single target mode, where I can look at how I did on just the Overfiend. So keep in mind, like I said, there's a whole bunch of adds in this fight, and so like I apply weakening with Blockade of Elements, and Blockade of Elements will randomly choose a target in there. like in its AoE, to apply my weakening enchant to. And so that's why like weakening is going to be lower, especially in AoE fights. In Crusher, if I accidentally light attack something that's not the boss, that'll cause it to go down. And then Minor Maim and Taunt are typically always supposed to be high. I apparently didn't do very good in this fight with Minor Maim, because that's only at 64%. But it's really just showing like exactly what your uptimes are. In a pure single target fight, let me see if I have any good examples here. Nope, I don't. I know that I have one saved, and so hopefully I'll put that up on the screen now. And you'll see that weakening and Crusher enchants, you want to be more around 80 to 90% of the time if you're a tank in a single target fight. And then Taunt and Minor Maim, you want up as close to 100% as you can get. Obviously, Minor Maim will never be quite at 100% because you should always initiate the fight with Taunt, and so then Major Fracture and Breach. But your next move is usually low slash and applying Minor Maim. One last thing I have to say about tank combat metrics is if you go over to damage received, it'll show you a few important things. One of the big things is it'll show you how many hits you blocked. And so this was a fight where I was perma-blocking, and I only blocked 26 hits in a 75-second long fight. So that's about one block every 3 seconds. And so that's really important, especially with the set Aegis of Gallenway, because it, to my surprise, Gallenway is a much worse set than it looks on paper, because it just does not proc enough. You quite simply just don't block anywhere near enough attacks for Gallenway to be useful. But that's a discussion for another video. Another thing you can see here is Igneous Shield, Concentrated Barrier, and Hardened Armor. I know that all of those things are damage shields, and so it shows how much damage each one of these things blocked for me. So Concentrated Barrier, despite it being a passive skill from the Psijic Order line, I'll show it here, right there. It absorbs 6100 damage and only comes back up if you don't block for 10 seconds. This is a like cumulative don't block for 10 seconds, and so the reason I know that is because I know in this fight, in this Overfiend fight, I didn't drop my block for 10 seconds consecutively, but as you can see, my Concentrated Barrier absorbed 18,000 damage, and so 3 full barriers rather than just the one. So this is especially helpful if you're wearing sets like Brands of Imperium. You get to see how much fucking damage Imperium absorbs. It's ridiculous. It's usually about half of Igneous, which is already stupid. But it also will show certain hits. You can see like what my biggest damage taken was, like Entropic Flurry, which I believe is the Overfiend smacking you a whole bunch of times at once. You can see how much damage that did, how much DPS I took from it, and things like that. And so if something's one-shotting you and you can't figure out why, this is super helpful there too. But yeah, that is about all of the information I have on combat metrics. I hope that this wasn't too rambly and long-winded. I know I can be like that sometimes. But please let me know if you have any questions at all about the add-on. It is a lovely add-on. Let me make sure I give proper credit. By Solanor and Decay. It's incredibly useful add-on. It helps us test what sets are good, what sets are bad, and things like that. And so huge shout out and thank you to them for this add-on. It is incredibly helpful. I use it every single time I play the game, and it is, I would be wearing some very bad sets if it wasn't for this add-on. So thanks again to them. Thank you all for watching. I will be putting out more videos like this, hopefully. And so if you have any ideas for the next ESO Insight video, let me know. Put it down in the comments below, or whisper me on in-game at Deltrox PCNA, or in Discord or something like that. And I hope you all have a wonderful day, and thank you for watching. Bye bye.